Hi everyone. So now that we know what an operational definition is, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the research methods that we can use to study behavior. We're going to start out with talking about non-experimental or correlational methods. So for a correlational method, we don't use any manipulation. We only observe the behavior in the natural setting. Um, Correlational methods could also include examining public records, such as going to the library and maybe looking at old letters of a historic person, looking at speeches from an individual, anything that happened in the past that was part of the public record, looking at newspapers and books, etc., could be used for this method. And then, of course, also we can ask people to describe their behavior, but we're not manipulating anything. So the goal of this methodology is, of course, to describe a phenomenon or behavior. Most of the time, the description is very informative, and it's really just a starting point for most research, right? Once we're starting out a new research area, we don't really know what to look for as researchers. So to really get started, to just get some ideas and variables that we could study in the future, we have to do this observational research. So this correlational method helps us identify important variables for certain phenomena. So, let's say you want to study something that's brand new, such as, I made the example here of studying aliens. You could also think about when Jane Goodall set out to better understand behaviors of chimps. At the time, we didn't actually know a whole lot about how chimps behaved in their natural settings. So the observational method is really useful because it really gives us an idea of, what variables to look for. It kind of is almost like a baseline. And in some cases, right, the observational method is the only method that's realistic, right? If you want to study migratory patterns in whales, we couldn't do that in captivity because they don't migrate. So the only way sometimes that we can do this type of research is through observation, and it's not something we can interfere with. Okay, so some observational research involves the researcher to actually go into the field and observe them in their natural setting. So most of the time it doesn't actually involve the direct asking of any questions, or there's no surveys or anything like that involved. Most of the time these researchers just go into the field and observe. The goal is to really be unobtrusive, and if that's not possible, there's some habituation that usually has to take place before you could start recording any of your data. So an example of a naturalistic observation, again, would be Jane Goodall. As I mentioned on the previous slide, she studied the behavior of chimps in Tanzania. She actually set out to go to Tanzania when she was fairly young, didn't even have a college degree, and she just, basically went out with a pen and paper and recorded behavior, just what she saw. And then later on, she actually coded for specific behavior. And but she had to first get an idea of what their basic behaviors were in order to do that. Another example would be, if you're interested in studying tribes that avoid modern civilization in India, for instance, that you would want to observe them in their natural setting. You would not want to necessarily ask them questions, but you just want to observe their way of life to gain a better understanding of how they live. And obviously, in both examples here, you would try to not interfere with their behavior, but it would probably take some time for the individuals or the chimps to get used to having an outsider there, because they're not used to having outsiders there. So once they're more used to a researcher being there, right, they behave normally, and then you can start recording data. There's obviously some limitations when you're using observational research. There's something called the experimenter expectancy effect, which basically means that as the experimenter, you go in with certain expectations, and because it's human nature that we kind of look for what we expect, right, that's a real threat to collecting actually real data. So something that would help sometimes is actually just to video record something and then have an individual who's blind to what you're even doing, actually rate the videotapes. So that's what we call blind raters, meaning that you're giving them an operational definition and you ask them to really look for and code for a specific behavior, but you don't tell them what the hypothesis or the goal of this research is. And the idea is that then they wouldn't be influenced by that and just basically objectively measure and rate for that behavior rather than bringing their own expectations into it. In other cases, also, we have multiple raters that get to rate these videotapes or recordings. And the idea is that if you have more than one rater, you can actually calculate something called the inter-rater reliability coefficient. And that really is to make sure that you have 2 or 3 separate raters. They should come to very similar, if not the same, conclusions once they're coding for a certain behavior. That again goes back to having a good operational definition. If it is very concrete and a reliable definition, right, then you wouldn't have that concern that it would be observed by different people in different ways. So you want to make sure that multiple people would actually report to see the same thing. Sometimes in observational research, there's hard to define variables involved that are probably difficult to define and come up with an operational definition. So that makes it, of course, a little bit more difficult. And of course, last but not least, through observational research, you can never infer causality. It's only an observation. You're not manipulating anything. So you can't really make those inferences. And then another method that's used in correlational research is using archival research or case studies. So archival research basically means that you're looking at written records. Written records could be different things. You could look at the census. You could look at old letters. You could, get a death certificate from a certain individual, or you could, study in a certain time period, maybe the cause of death on all the death certificates. Maybe if there was some kind of epidemic going around, you could identify that using those records. So that would be archival research, which is oftentimes used by historians or maybe even anthropologists in some cases. A case study, on the other hand, is really looking at one individual and taking a very close look at their life. Most of the time, case studies are useful if you're looking at a rare or unusual case and there's something to be learned about that person. It's common, of course, in clinical research, but it's actually also sometimes used in neuroscience because there's a lot to be learned from how certain people, after they had a specific brain injury, behave differently afterwards. So that, again, teaches us about what areas of the brain are associated with different brain areas. And before we had the ability to use fMRIs and MRIs, that was pretty much the only way that we could really learn about how the brain works and which areas of the brain are associated with certain behaviors. One great example of this would be HM. So this was an individual who was studied in 1957 and he passed away just a few years ago. And he was really studied his entire life. So patient HM actually suffered from severe seizures when he was younger. And to alleviate his seizures, they conducted a brain surgery that removed parts of his temporal lobes and parts of his hippocampus on both hemispheres. And again, they did this to alleviate his seizures, and the treatment was effective. It did help with the seizures and improved his quality of life in that respect. However, after he had the surgery, he actually was unable to commit any new events or memories to long-term memory. So his working memory and procedural memory were intact, but he couldn't form any new memories, which, you have to question if that was an improvement in quality of life. But so based on this finding, right, HM had his hippocampus and temporal lobes, parts of his temporal lobes removed, And we actually learned a lot about memory from patient HM, and we learned that the hippocampus plays a crucial role in memory formation. So this would be a great example of where, even though it's just one person, one individual, so we have to keep in mind obviously that there's limitations because it's a very small n, but there's a lot to be learned in cases of people that have rare disease, or they have a very rare brain injury, or they underwent a rare surgery, like in this case, and then see how that affects their behavior. So we can make inferences about which brain areas serve different purposes. And then, of course, also we have surveys that we can use for correlational research. There's different ways that you can send out surveys. It could be either an interview or a questionnaire that's administered in a natural setting. We can call people or send them information in the mail. But of course, nowadays, a lot of times they're sent out via the internet. There's obviously some problems with that because you always have to wonder, right, how old is the person on the other end? And most of the time, people, when they call other people to interview them, right, they get hung up on. Or if you get an internet survey in your email inbox, most of the time we delete it. But that's one way that we can collect information from people. So if you decide that you wanted to administer a survey to your participants, you have to think about the different methods that you can use to sample. There's different ways that we can do that. There's something called probability sampling, which basically means that you're actually randomly sampling from your population of interest, meaning that each person should have an equal chance of being selected. Systematic random sampling means that you're kind of restricting yourself to a certain source. So for instance, you use the phone book, some people aren't going to be listed in the phone book, therefore you're going to automatically exclude some people. Another way that you could sample is that you first divide people into subgroups, and then you randomly sample from those subgroups. So it could be, for instance, that you're interested in behavior from different age groups. So you have, different age groups, and then you actually randomly sample from each of those subgroups. And then we can, of course, also use non-random sampling methods, which we sometimes also refer to as a convenient sample, meaning that anybody who is willing and able to respond will take. And sometimes with research, right, it's so difficult, especially with surveys, to get responses from people. So you sometimes have to take what you can get, and you can't really be picky. Of course, there's some potential problems with these surveys, right? Not only do we have trouble actually getting people to fill them out, but there's also something to be said about some limitations based on volunteer bias. So you have to wonder, are maybe the people that typically fill out these surveys just fundamentally different from people who don't respond, right? So you have the selection bias among people that fill them out and people that don't fill them out. Then we also have the problem, of course, with dishonesty, right? It's a survey, you're asking questions, people want to look good, right? That's social desirability, also sometimes called keeping up appearances. So if you ask a question that's sensitive, such as do you wash your hands after going to the bathroom, everybody, of course, will say yes. But they actually have done some research where they recorded that in bathrooms, in public bathrooms, and the number wasn't close to 100%, sadly. So we do know that people are not always honest when they're answering these questions. So that's, of course, something that we always have to keep in mind when we're doing research with surveys. All right, so this would be all for today for Chapter 4.